Have you ever walked into a meeting room and immediately known something was wrong? That's exactly how I felt the moment I stepped into conference room B at Westmont Partners. It was supposed to be a routine meeting. An email from HR marked it as team performance calibration. Nothing alarming. Just another corporate buzzword, right? But when I opened the door, I froze. 17 of my coworkers were already seated, faces blank, eyes locked on me. My manager, Becca Lane, stood at the front of the room with a clipboard. Next to her, Lucas, the HR rep, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. There was only one chair left, placed dead center, facing everyone. No agenda, no screen, no coffee, just silence. Juliette, Becca said, fake, smiling like we were about to play charades. Thanks for joining. Please have a seat. I sat down slowly, my pulse already climbing. Something in the air felt off, too calm, too rehearsed. That's when Becca lifted the clipboard and began reading. Over the past 6 months, concerns have been raised regarding your integration with team culture. We've compiled a document outlining 148 instances that suggest a lack of alignment. She said it like she was announcing weather updates. And then she started listing them one by one. Juliette often arrives before 8 a.m., making others feel inadequate. She rarely participates in casual conversation. Her productivity exceeds team norms, creating pressure on others. My throat tightened. Was this real? Was I being disciplined for working too hard? They called it feedback, but it felt like execution. Each line was another cut paper, thin but relentless. And the worst part, no one said a word. Not the people I'd helped. Not the ones whose mistakes I'd quietly fixed. They just stared, waiting for me to cry, apologize, or run out of the room. But I did none of those things. Instead, I sat there and thought, is this what happens when you refuse to play office politics? When you let your work speak instead of your voice? Have you ever been blindsided by the very people you thought were on your side? If yes, keep watching, because what I did next changed everything. I didn't start out trying to be invisible. 3 years ago, I walked into the lobby of Westmont Partners in a navy blazer that didn't quite fit, holding a leather-bound portfolio I'd practiced opening a dozen times. I was 26, newly certified in business analytics, and terrified I'd be found out as an imposter before lunch. But then the elevator doors opened, and no one noticed I was nervous. No one noticed me at all. At first, I thought that was a good thing. I was hired as a junior strategist, entry level, low stakes. The job was mostly about cleaning up datasets, formatting reports, and making the senior consultants look sharper than they actually were. No glory. No credit. But I didn't mind. I loved solving problems, especially the ones no one else saw coming. In the first week, I discovered that one of our client dashboards used in every quarterly review was pulling from outdated metrics. No one had checked it in over a year. So I rewrote the logic, corrected the formulas, and sent a quiet email to my manager, flagged as low priority. The next day, that same dashboard was praised in a major client meeting. My name wasn't mentioned. I shrugged it off. When a system crashed during a product launch, I restored it using backups I'd saved to my own drive just in case. When a senior partner promised a deliverable he hadn't even started, I stayed until midnight to build it from scratch. No one asked me to. No one thanked me either. Still, I kept doing it. I believed that excellence would eventually speak for itself. That people would notice not just what I did, but who I was. What I didn't realize was that the more I fixed, the more I made others look competent. And the more they looked competent, the less they wanted to admit they needed fixing. It became a pattern. I'd quietly rebuild a broken model, and someone else would present it. I'd reroute a failing workflow, and a manager would get the credit. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I just moved on to the next fire. There was a strange satisfaction in it, being the person who made the chaos manageable, who kept things together with duct tape and caffeine. I told myself I didn't need praise. I told myself I was building trust. But deep down, something started to shift. When I passed a project off to Becca Leneath, woman who would later lead the feedback session, she smiled and said, "Perfect, I'll run with this. You're a lifesaver, Juliette." Then she sent it to the client with her name in bold on every slide. It didn't feel like teamwork. It felt like erasure. And still, I stayed silent. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was fear. Maybe I just didn't want to believe that doing good work could ever be the wrong kind of visible. But I was beginning to learn. Being excellent isn't always enough. Not when you're surrounded by people more invested in looking successful than actually being successful. So I kept building from the shadow, solving, fixing, rescuing. Like an architect designing a structure no one realized was there. Until the day they tried to tear it down. It started small. A casual nod from a manager after a successful presentation. "Great work, team," they'd say, even though only one person had stayed past midnight cleaning up the numbers. Sometimes it was Becca forwarding one of my reports with a cheerful, "Here's what I pulled together, let me know your thoughts." Other times, it was silence. No reply. No acknowledgement. Just disappearance. The thing about working in consulting is that everything moves fast. There's always another deliverable, another deadline, another crisis to put out. So when your work gets absorbed by someone more senior, you're expected to be flattered. As if there's spotlight shining on your work even without your name's some kind of compliment. I convinced myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was learning, growing, becoming essential behind the scenes. But the pattern got harder to ignore. One morning, I sat in a client debrief as Becca walked them through a strategic model I had built from scratch based on 3 weeks of interviews, surveys, and late nights poring over data. She spoke like she had lived inside every chart. She used my phrasing, my logic, my color scheme. I watched her move through the slides, one by one, never hesitating, never looking in my direction. And when the client clapped at the end, she smiled, nodded, and said, "I'm just glad it all came together." Second, I wanted to speak. I wanted to raise my hand and say, "Actually, I built that." But I didn't. Because the moment passed. And because I knew how that would look. People in power rarely like to be corrected in public. And people who don't take credit easily, they don't usually get offered more of it. So I stayed quiet, again. Later that week, a department-wide email went out congratulating Becca for revitalizing our analytics framework. She got a standing ovation at the next staff meeting. Meanwhile, I was tasked with scrubbing legacy files for inconsistencies because, in her words, "You're just so good at finding those tiny things the rest of us miss." I smiled. I nodded. I did the work. And every time it happened, I felt something inside me go a little more numb. I stopped suggesting ideas in meetings, not because I didn't have them, but because I knew where they'd end upon someone else's slide deck. When a newer consultant asked me why I didn't fight harder for recognition, I told her, because fighting takes energy, and right now, I'm using every ounce of mine to keep the company from falling apart. She looked confused. So I added, "They don't see it, but that's the job. Keeping the whole thing standing while pretending I don't mind who gets the applause." It wasn't just about being overlooked. It was about being erased. Every solution I gave them became someone else's stepping stone. But the truth about foundations is this: you only notice them when they crack. And eventually, cracks always show. They never said it was about my work. No one ever looked me in the eye and said, "Juliette, your analysis is wrong," or "Your strategy cost us a client." Because it wasn't. And it didn't. Instead, they said things like, "She's not very approachable. She tends to eat lunch at her desk. Daughter. She doesn't come out for happy hour." It became clear that in the eyes of my team, I wasn't failing professionally, I was failing socially. Apparently, solving 3 workflow bottlenecks in 1 week wasn't enough to offset the fact that I didn't want to talk about reality television or make a TikTok for the holiday party. And somehow, that made me a problem. I remember one Tuesday afternoon, Becca stopped by my desk and said in this overly sweet tone, "You know, A few people have noticed you don't join in on the kitchen banter. You okay? I looked up from a spreadsheet. I was deep into fixing an error in a cost model someone else had completely botched and said, "Yeah, I'm just trying to get this file cleaned up before Yad." She nodded, but not like she understood. More like she was adding another bullet to an invisible list. Later that week, Lucas from HR bumped into me in the break room and casually asked, "So, do you feel connected to the team? Like, socially?" I gave a polite answer. Something generic. But I knew what was happening. The whispers had started. The narrative was forming. Juliette doesn't fit in. Never mind that I was mentoring 2 junior analysts. Never mind that I spent most of my day making sure other people's deadlines didn't implode. None of that counted as teamwork unless I also played ping pong, stayed late for trivia night, and laughed at jokes I didn't find funny. At one point, someone slipped a flyer onto my keyboard for the company pajama-themed Zoom karaoke night. I stared at it, wondering if this was an actual event or some kind of test. Because here's what no one seemed willing to admit. I wasn't antisocial. I was just busy. While they talked about brunch spots, I followed up with clients who hadn't received their Q3 projections. While they planned Secret Santa, I debugged the financial model that had stalled the Oakdale contract. But none of that showed up in the team bonding metrics. At Westmont, culture wasn't just an atmosphere, it was currency. And I didn't trade in small talk. I didn't know the names of every Bachelor contestant. I didn't have time to rehearse a group dance for TikTok. So I became cold, private, hard to connect with. They used phrases like team alignment and social cohesion, but what they really meant was, "She doesn't mirror us." It was subtle. No one ever confronted me directly. But the temperature around me began to shift. I'd enter a room and conversations would pause. I'd open Slack and find fewer and fewer threads where I was tagged. The more I focused on work, the more they treated me like I didn't belong. And slowly, I started to believe them. Not because I thought I was broken, but because when you're constantly told your value depends on how well you play the game and you never wanted to play it in the first place, you start to wonder if there's a place for you at all. It came on a Wednesday. I was elbows deep in a restructure model for one of our legacy logistics clients trying to make sense of 15 conflicting spreadsheets when my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally, I let it go to voicemail. But something made me answer. "Hi, is this Juliette Moore?" Her voice was calm, professional. "This is Ava Cardenas. I'm with Ardent and Rowe." I froze. Ardent and Rowe wasn't just any firm. They were the firm. The one Westmont Partners lost bids to. The one with the clean branding, the perfect decks, the air of knowing exactly what clients wanted before they even asked. I'd studied their work, quietly admired their polish. They didn't call people like me. "I hope this isn't a bad time," she said. "We've been reviewing performance patterns in the industry, and your name keeps coming up. Would you be open to a conversation?" My throat went dry. "I suppose?" She didn't waste time. She told me they'd been tracking key client accounts that had remained unusually stable at Westmont, contracts that should have lapsed, but didn't. Presentations that over-delivered. Turnarounds that defied the internal capabilities they believed Westmont had. And somehow, my name kept surfacing in the background. Quietly, consistently. Ava paused and said, "To be clear, we're not interested in recruiting people just for their job titles. We're looking for the people actually driving results. And everything we've seen suggests that person is you." I didn't know what to say. I'd spent 3 years being told I didn't fit. Suddenly, someone was telling me I was the reason things still held together. She outlined the offer. Triple my current salary. A $200,000 signing bonus. A dedicated team. My own office. And for the first time, formal recognition for the work I'd been doing in the dark. I didn't respond right away. I told her I needed time to think. She understood. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at the Westmont logo in the corner of my screen. My calendar blinked with 3 overdue meetings I hadn't been invited to. I could hear laughter down the hall from the break room. The contrast was unbearable. I should have jumped at the offer. Who wouldn't? But there was a part of me deep, stubborn, and loyal that still wanted Westmont to see me, to value me, to realize what they had before someone else claimed it. I wanted to believe that if I just worked a little harder, stayed a little longer, they'd come around. That maybe, just maybe, merit still meant something. But I knew that if I said yes to Ardent and Rowe, everything would change. I wouldn't just be leaving a job. I'd be walking away from a version of myself that had waited years for permission to be seen. And I wasn't sure I was ready. Not yet. Things changed after that call. Not in any loud, obvious way. No one cornered me in the hallway or asked if I was thinking of leaving. No, the shift was quieter than that. More calculated. The first thing I noticed was the sudden drop in eye contact. I'd walk into meetings, and conversations would pause, not in surprise, but in choreography, as if they'd practiced freezing the moment I entered. My calendar started filling with vague, mandatory check-ins. Pulse review. Collaboration sync. Cross-functional feedback loop. Titles that meant nothing but took up just enough time to make sure I couldn't get anything meaningful done between them. And then came the miscommunications. Becca forwarded me a client brief for a proposal that was due Friday. The document had glaring inconsistencies, so I rewrote its standard procedure for me. That Friday, during the pitch rehearsal, she looked genuinely confused. "This isn't the version I sent you," she said, flipping through the slides with theatrical disappointment. "It's the one you attached on Monday," I replied, opening her email. She frowned. "That must have been a draft. Why didn't you check with me?" After the meeting, Lucas from HR popped by my desk again. Same casual tone. "Hey Juliette, just wanted to make sure you're not feeling overwhelmed lately. A few folks have mentioned you seem a little tense." He blinked. "Tense?" He smiled, too wide. "It's probably nothing, but we want to make sure everyone's feeling supported." Support. That word started showing up everywhere. On sticky notes. In email signatures. In passive-aggressive Slack messages. When I pushed back on a timeline that was literally impossible, Becca replied, "I hear you, Juliette, but this is a great opportunity to demonstrate flexibility." When I asked why I'd been left out of a meeting with one of my clients, I was told, "We assumed you were too heads down lately. We didn't want to burden you." And then came the real kicker, the performance conversation. Becca invited me to a private meeting on a Thursday afternoon. She had a notepad, the company values booklet, and that same calm HR smile I'd started to dread. "We've had some feedback," she began, "about your interpersonal dynamics." I stared at her. "From who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she read bullet points in a measured tone. "Juliette has difficulty connecting with peers. She tends to dominate problem-solving spaces. She appears dismissive of team-building efforts." "I've mentored 2 analysts this quarter," I said. "I've hit every deliverable. I've picked up 3 extra accounts." Becca nodded. "Your work is strong. But we're talking about team fit. Collaboration isn't just about output." I walked out of that meeting feeling like I'd been spun in a circle, then told to walk straight. Was I missing something? Were they right? Had I become too cold? Too guarded? Or were they trying to make me doubt my own clarity? Have you ever been made to question yourself just because you stopped tolerating the noise? Stick around. The moment that changed everything was just ahead. The email arrived at 6:47 p.m. Subject: Mandatory Team Performance Session. Thursday, 2 p.m. From Becca Lane. TO. All staff, Strated Division. The body was short and corporate. Just enough words to feel official, not enough to raise alarms. As part of our ongoing effort to strengthen cross-functional collaboration and promote a culture of transparency, this session will focus on shared team values and communication alignment. Attendance is required. It didn't strike me as suspicious. Westmont had a dozen of these meetings a year. Most were harmless, over-processed, under-effective workshops with whiteboards and sticky notes. I assumed this would be more of the same. I didn't realize I was walking into an ambush. Thursday came. I wore dark slacks and a green blouse, simple, professional, unremarkable. The conference room was on the 19th floor, one of the larger ones reserved for group sessions. I got there 2 minutes early. The door was already open. What I saw stopped me cold. Every seat was filled. 17 of my colleagues lined both sides of the long mahogany table. At the head of the room, Becca stood with a thick folder in her hands. Beside her, Lucas from HR, arms crossed, face unreadable. There was only one empty chair directly across from them, positioned to face the entire group. That was my seat. I stepped inside slowly, scanning the room. No one smiled, no one greeted me, they just watched. Becca gestured toward the chair. Juliette, thanks for being on time. Please have a seat. I sat down. My hands were cold. Then I noticed the screen behind Becca. A pale blue banner with corporate serif font read, Team Accountability Forum. Building a better culture together. Becca opened the folder and began reading. Over the past quarter, she said, our team has gathered qualitative feedback regarding behaviors that impact group cohesion. We believe transparency is essential to growth, so we've compiled the concerns into a structured list. Today, we'll review those items together. And then, she began. Item 1. Juliette frequently arrives early, causing others to feel scrutinized. Item 2. She does not initiate social conversations, creating a perception of aloofness. Item 3. Her email tone has been described as too direct. Item 4. She often finishes assignments well before deadline, creating performance imbalances. Each sentence landed like a pebble dropped in a still pond, small but deliberate. By item 10, I stopped counting. The room blurred. It was like being dissected alive under office lighting. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't attack me outright. They just read, one by one, every minor behavior, every personal quirk, every difference, and labeled it a defect. Brings lunch from home, implying judgment of others' choices. Rarely participates in Slack emoji threads. Declined 2 birthday card signings. Corrected a data error without looping in the original author. I looked around the table, trying to find one face that looked uncomfortable. One pair of eyes that said, this isn't okay. I found none. It wasn't feedback, it was performance theater. And I was the show. Somewhere between too independent and takes too many notes during meetings, I felt something inside me lock into place. Not break harden. They weren't trying to help me grow. They were trying to break me. To push me into quitting without ever saying the word. And they thought I wouldn't see it coming. They were wrong. They finished reading item 148. For a moment, the room went silent. Not the kind of silence that invites reflection. No. This was the kind of silence that waits. That expects collapse. That listens for a tear, a stammer, a final breath of dignity leaving the body. I didn't give them that. I sat still in the center of the room, 17 pairs of eyes watching like they'd just witnessed a successful execution. A few looked pleased. Some looked relieved. None looked sorry. Becca lowered the folder. Juliette, she said gently, we wanted you to hear this directly. Transparency fosters growth. My hands were resting on my lap. Calm. Collected. Inside, I felt like glass, but not the kind that shatters. The kind that cuts. I stood slowly, adjusted the sleeves of my blouse, and reached into my blazer pocket for my phone. I appreciate the feedback, I said evenly. Then I dialed a number I had memorized for weeks. It rang once. Then twice. Hello? Ava, I said. It's Juliette Moore. I'm ready to accept your offer. There was a pause on the line then. Her voice brightened. That's wonderful to hear. Are you comfortable with the full package, including the relocation stipend and signing bonus? Yes, I said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. The $250,000 bonus works just fine. A few heads turned sharply. Becca's smile twitched. Lucas blinked twice. I kept going. I can start Monday. And yes, I'm happy to bring my client accounts with me. I've already outlined the transition plan. Someone, maybe Devon, actually dropped his pen. I ended the call, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and looked directly at Becca. Thank you again. This session has been clarifying. Then I turned to the others. My voice stayed calm, but my words hit clean. You spent the last hour trying to convince me I didn't belong here. You were right, just not in the way you meant. Becca opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. No need. I won't be finishing out the week. I'll be collecting my things tomorrow before business hours. Don't worry, I won't make a scene. That's not my style. I stepped toward the door, then paused. Oh, and one more thing, I said, glancing at Lucas. You might want to review the firm's policy on client relationship ownership. I've maintained independent records for the past 3 years. Every call, every deliverable, every insight. The clients didn't stay because of Westmont. They stayed because of me. And then I walked out. There was no applause, no retaliation. Just the soft creak of the conference room door swinging shut behind me and the unmistakable sound of 17 people realizing they had just orchestrated their own collapse. If you've ever wanted to stand up and walk away on your own terms, you're going to want to hear what happened next. I left the office the next morning at 7:45 a.m. No goodbye party. No passive-aggressive farewell email. Just a cardboard box, a locked drawer full of notebooks, and 3 years' worth of client maps I had built myself. It was quiet. I liked it that way. By 9:15 a.m., I was sitting in my apartment with my laptop open, a fresh legal pad by my side, and a coffee that wasn't brewed in a shared kitchen with filtered gossip hanging in the air. And at 9:42 a.m., the first call came in. Juliette, it's Ryan Feldman from Cortex Solutions. We heard through the grapevine that you're no longer with Westmont. We'd like to discuss next steps, assuming you're open to continuing our relationship. He blinked. Cortex was one of Westmont's oldest clients, quiet, loyal, low maintenance. The kind of account people forget about because it never screamed for help. But I'd been managing their supply-side forecasting since year 1. I knew the name of Ryan's toddler. I knew how he took his coffee. I knew when to push him and when to back off. Of course, I said, steadying my voice. I'm with Ardent and Rowe now. Would Thursday afternoon work for a meeting? By 11 a.m., 2 more calls had come in. By 2 p.m., it was 6. Every conversation sounded the same. We heard you're gone. We're not happy with the handoff. Can we talk? Some were polite. Some were frustrated. All of them were clear, they didn't want the firm. They wanted me. I hadn't sent out a single email. I hadn't posted a LinkedIn announcement. But apparently, my absence spoke louder than any campaign ever could. Clients started requesting transition audits. They asked Ardent and Rowe for NDAs, for onboarding kits, for scope alignments. They weren't just interested, they were ready. One call stood out. Juliette, it's Candace from Marotech. Listen, we've been considering moving vendors for a while, but your departure kind of sealed it for us. Can we be blunt? You were the reason we stayed as long as we did. Of section. I remember staring at my screen after that call, not smiling, not crying, just stunned. I had spent so long wondering if I was invisible. And now, the people I thought barely noticed me were making moves because I wasn't in the room anymore. At Westmont, I was told I didn't belong. Outside of it, I became the reason people left. There was no PR blast. No retaliation. Just silence. And then, gradually, the silence turned into murmurs. A rumor here. A cancellation there. An email chain forwarded one too many times. And then the clients began walking. Quietly. Decisively. Like someone unlocking the door they'd been afraid to touch for years. It turns out, people do notice. They notice when someone listens. They notice when their concerns are solved without being dismissed. They notice when the person who held everything together is suddenly no longer answering the phone. They notice. And then they act. The new office wasn't flashy. It was a second-floor space in a glass building on Grant Street, with neutral walls, an open layout, and sunlight that poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows from mid-morning to late afternoon. But, to me, it was a fortress. The name on the lease was Ardent and Rowe, Regional Client Services Division. The plaque by the front door listed one title that made my breath catch. Juliette Moore, Director, Client Loyalty Operations. I stood there for a long minute, just looking at it. No fanfare. No confetti. Just recognition. And right outside those windows, across a narrow street, was the building I had walked into for 3 years of my life. Westmont Partners. Frosted glass. Navy awnings. Still trying to look important. You couldn't have planned it better if you tried. It wasn't intentional, at least not by me. Arden already had the lease in negotiation when I signed on. But when Ava asked if I'd like to lead the regional office, I didn't hesitate. There's something poetic about it, she said, handing me the keys. Besides, I have a feeling a few familiar faces might walk through these doors soon. She was right. By our third week, 4 client strategy meetings had been scheduled on site. All 4 with companies that had once held long-term contracts with Westmont. I didn't reach out. I didn't have to. They found me. I watched from the window one morning as the director of procurement at Helix Corp parked his car directly in front of Westmont's lobby, then walked across the street to our building instead. He paused for a second, looked up at the signage, and smiled before heading inside. It wasn't revenge. Not really. It was reclamation. One afternoon, while setting up a whiteboard in our newly finished war room, I glanced out the window and saw Becca Lane walking briskly down the sidewalk, phone to her ear. She glanced up just for a second and saw the Ardent logo mounted above our glass doors. She didn't slow down, but her shoulders stiffened. I didn't move. There was nothing to say. Every day, our new space filled in more. Plants, notebooks, coffee mugs that actually got washed. Analysts who brought ideas instead of egos. We didn't have corporate jargon printed on the walls. We didn't need it. Respect was embedded in every decision. I didn't have to fight for credit anymore. I didn't have to defend my working hours or my silence during small talk. I got to lead the way I had always wanted to, through consistency, clarity, and care. And the view from my desk facing the building where I was once deemed a misfit served as the perfect reminder. Sometimes, you don't need to burn bridges. You just need to build a better one across the street. The funny thing about starting over is that it doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like ordering the wrong size whiteboard. It feels like assembling chairs with missing screws. It feels like staring at an empty fridge in a half-furnished office at 7 p.m. and realizing no one remembered to order coffee. But slowly, piece by piece, it starts to take shape. By the end of month 2, our team had grown to 7. By month 4, it was 12. By month 6, we hit 19, most of them people I'd either mentored in the past or admired from afar. And not one of them asked me, "What do I wear to fit in here?" Because they didn't have to. We didn't build a culture around ping-pong tables or Slack emojis. We built it around clarity, accountability, respect. People showed up on time not because of fear, but because their work mattered. Meetings started with questions like, "What's blocking you?" and ended with, "What do you need from me?" No one rolled their eyes at late nights because no one was expected to work late to prove their loyalty. We took lunch breaks seriously. We shut our laptops at a reasonable hour. We praised good work publicly, and we corrected mistakes privately. It was quiet, intentional, functional, and for the first time in years, I felt safe walking into a room without scanning for politics. I saw myself reflected in the people around me, not in how they dressed or how extroverted they were, but in their focus, in their integrity, in the way they listened more than they talked. And little by little, the scars from Westmont began to soften. It wasn't just about business. It was about building a place I didn't have to recover from every night. A place where no one had to choose between being respected and being themselves. I remember one morning, I got in early, made a cup of coffee, and stood by the window, watching as the city stirred awake. The streets were quiet. The office still smelled like new carpet and cardboard. Then I heard a laugh from the hallway, genuine, light, unguarded. It belonged to Sarah, our junior strategist. She'd started just 2 weeks ago. Bright, soft-spoken, brilliant. The kind of person who would have been eaten alive in my old world. But here, she was thriving. She walked past my door holding a client brief and said, "Hey, I finally figured out that KPI conflict you flagged. Want to see it?" And just like that, no politics, no posturing, real collaboration happened. That moment stayed with me, because in that small exchange, I saw everything I had spent the past year trying to prove. That great work doesn't need noise. That good people don't need to be pushed into boxes. That a workplace can be both excellent and humane. And if it didn't exist before, then maybe it was always mine to build. Sometimes, I still think about that list. 148 reasons why I wasn't a cultural fit. A list typed in Times New Roman, bullet-pointed, printed, and read aloud in a room where no one had the courage to speak to me like a human being. At the time, it felt like a verdict. Now, it feels like a mirror held up not to reflect my flaws, but their fears. Reason number 7. Juliette prefers written communication. Because clarity made them uncomfortable. Reason number 22. She often completes projects without asking for help. Because independence threatened the illusion of collaboration. Reason number 61. She doesn't laugh during team calls. Because I was too busy thinking about real problems. Reason number 131. She brings her own coffee. That one still makes me laugh. I used to read that list in my head and feel shame. Now, I read it as a resume. Every flaw they named was a reason I survived. Every bullet point was evidence that I saw things they refused to see and fixed them before they even noticed the cracks. They told me I didn't belong. But what they really meant was, you don't shrink yourself to make us comfortable. You don't wait to be told what's broken. You don't ask permission to be excellent. And they were right. I don't. That list wasn't a reason to leave. It was 148 reasons to rise. Today, that number is framed in my office not out of spite, but as a reminder. Your value doesn't decrease because others fail to understand it. I walk into work now and see a team that shows up with curiosity instead of competition. Clients who trust our process because they know our integrity is real. Colleagues who speak up not to cut others down, but to lift the whole thing higher. And most of all, I see people like I used to be, quiet, focused, capable, finally given room to breathe. Not every day is perfect. We still miss deadlines. Still argue. Still spill coffee and forget birthdays. But no one's hiding. No one's afraid to speak. And no one ever sits alone in the center of a conference room waiting to be torn apart for daring to care too much. That's what rebuilding looks like. It doesn't always come with applause. It comes with trust, with peace, with knowing your name is on the door because you earned it and not because someone finally let you have it. If you've ever been called too quiet, too intense, too much, or not enough for simply doing your job, well, tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story. Because maybe it's time we stopped trying to fit in and started building places where we actually belong.